Is decision-making difficult for you? Do you ever lay sleepless wondering what you're going to do with your life? Worrying so much you feel unable to make a single choice because you don't want to settle down on a path where you won't be able to retrace your steps? Then urban planning is not for you. This is Paris, known for its historical architecture and well-thought-out plan. It is a city that takes pride in conservation, where skyscrapers have been banned from its central parts. This was not so much a philosophy this man based his work on. This is George Eugene Haussmann, the prefect of Seine in the mid-1800s. He took upon himself to restructure Paris to what we know it to be today, creating a modern city with boulevards and monuments that meant the destruction of thousands and thousands of buildings and homes. And this approach, while drastic in the case of Paris, would become central in modernizing cities throughout the following century, sometimes with plans so ridiculous you don't even know where to begin. Poor urban design is visible. It stands out. Like a football referee, sometimes doing your work the best means going unnoticed. There are for sure buildings we like more than others, but mainly we like buildings when they work together with its surroundings and create a nice atmosphere. But anger from the public against urban development is more than just poor architecture, isn't it? Humans have a complicated relationship with change overall. It must not be too drastic and new that we feel out of place, yet not so mundane and subtle that we feel deprived of progress. Not the least, we all have our personal preferences and project other more overarching developments in society on individual changes, causing us to feel very differently about a specific building or neighborhood. Try erecting a religious building somewhere in the city and see what varying reactions you get. Many are those who have felt the urge to answer what makes a city great. Philosophers in ancient Greece, architects in the 1800s, YouTubers in the 2020s. And it is sometimes easy to find answers that seem very solid and applicable, but it is tricky to take into account all aspects of city life. And it is not the least tricky to factor in all the actors that play a role in creating urban spaces, from governments all the way down to individual users, via communities, businesses and property owners. The European old towns are more attractive than the American grid cities. The winding roads with narrow back alleys, high-density residential and commercial mixed zoning feels just much more human than huge square apartment complexes on block after block with large avenues in between houses. But the old centers of cities are in many ways fixed in time. To get modern city services to work in these areas is difficult. Try to stop a large fire, establish working garbage collection, or lay down high-speed fiber network, and you might see why. These old areas work in many ways because they represent the exception. Imagining a 10 million people city built using building codes from the Renaissance, and you will run into problems. In the early and mid-1900s, so-called Modernism was the architectural style of every major and architect. In many cities still today, this is as much of a dominating as hated style. In the US, this was the time of white, affluent people buying their first cars and moving away from the city to newly built suburban areas. We will talk more about this development in an upcoming video. But the cities were affected as well. Now buildings were to be freestanding, large, with room for air and space in between them. Industry was zoned away from city centers, and there were to be more separation between building uses. The accessibility of the car was the central theme. Movement became the central aspect of planning, not place itself. Le Corbusier was one of the driving architects behind this development. The city will become part of the country. I shall live 30 miles from my office in one direction. My secretary will live 30 miles away from it too, in the other direction, under another pine tree. We shall both own cars, we shall use up tires, wear out road surfaces and gears, consume oil and gasoline. Quotes like this almost feel like a parody of a time before environmentalism. You don't have to work hard to feel the modernism in his writing. There were a lot of problems with this approach to city planning. The so-called towers in the park he envisioned, and that was realized in many places around the world, often became a tower surrounded by parking space. There was not much room for pedestrians in these cities, and the living street with businesses and restaurants disappeared when they were zoned away. During this time, many older buildings and whole neighborhoods were torn down to make space for the new, for the futuristic, for the ever wealthier population. Most buildings and neighborhoods built today do not follow these guidelines, but there are exceptions, not the least in middle-income nations. But it is easy from today's perspective to miss why this approach, this uprooting of history, was not only accepted but popular during this time, and why it might be tempting in many fast-growing cities still today. The first cities established was in current-day Iran and Iraq, around 3000 BC. Ancient Rome was huge by the standards of the time, with 500,000 inhabitants. Most cities in the area before electrification were small. They were basically all walkable, partly as a result of the need for a protecting city wall around its perimeter, but mostly just a natural result of how distance worked. This scale is of course still visible in many old town city centers today. Horse carriages and later electrified trams or light railway meant cities could grow further, and London became the golden star of Europe in this regard, with 1 million inhabitants around 1800. But still then, only a few percent of the total population lived in cities. The advances in agricultural methods and technologies meant fewer were needed on farms and could seek job opportunities in newly established industries in the cities. And the whole Industrial Revolution was underway. The cities in the 1800s were cramped, congested and dirty. The mortality rates were so high that the only reason they grew was that so many moved in. A lack of healthcare, fresh water, sanitation, garbage collection and refrigeration, alongside dirty industries and livestock, meant diseases spread like never before. With close to no exception, rural life was much healthier than urban life at this time. And modernism was fighting all that. Modernism made buildings safer, moved away from wood that made cities so prone to burning down, made space for firefighters, police, ambulances and garbage trucks. And in many instances it made cities attractable for the growing middle class again, if not for living, at least for work. Zoning residential areas away from commercial and office spaces meant that the poorer people that were left in the city centers were moved out of sight from those commuting in and out of the city. We will talk more about the social aspects of this development in another video. Today, mortality is nowhere near as high in cities in low-income nations as it was in the European cities in the 1800s, but we can still see examples of mortality being higher in cities than in the surrounding rural areas in some of the really poor nations on Earth. Modernism becoming the fundamental concept behind all urban development during several decades brought on huge changes to our cities, but by being associated with the future, development and economic growth, the quickly altered environments escaped a great share of the potential criticism. Criticism and regret that instead emerged much later, kicking in like a bad hangover. Jane Jacobs was in a way an exception. She wrote The Death and Life of Great American Cities already in the 1950s. There she takes an approach to buildings and city layout that was lacking in the modernist approach. She included people. Maybe she is most known for her view on the city's street. She wanted to see living streets, with stores and restaurants, with much space for pedestrians and cyclists. Streets with humans present at all times during the day, evening and night were safe streets. She also pointed to the importance of inhabitants and visitors feeling a connection to the area. When they do, they are more likely to interact with one another, to have trust in the people around you, and to help others and stand up to crime. Sidewalks are the place of problems, she acknowledges, but they are better places for the problems than many others, and removing sidewalks only moves the problems away out of sight, to places where adults can scold children and teens for wrongdoings, where criminals aren't caught in the act, reported, and feel the strong social force of united tenants. Jacobs was not a fan of skyscrapers. The establishing of tall buildings only for offices, with no living sidewalks, created areas that were used only for a short period during the day, before everyone left and a dead street remained. In the same way, giant parking lots, gas stations or oversized establishments killed streets and made them impossible to interact with for pedestrians. Jacobs was also quite critical of parks, which could be explained by the high crime rates in parks during this time, a phenomenon that later was much less prominent in American cities. A central theme in urban planning, moving away from the modernist ideas, is place building. It is all about that forming of a sense of place for humans that in the end interact with the environments, whether they do so as inhabitants, visitors or workers. Building a city, piece of cake. Building a sustainable, successful, popular city, piece of very intricate, multi-layered, slow-cooked cake. So to go back to the Rhino city, what was up with that? Well, it was a plan for the major cities of South Sudan back around 2010. Other plans included the shape of a pineapple and a giraffe. You can see here on the map where the ministers and diplomats were supposed to live, where the rest of the nice housing were, and the cheaper housings throughout the legs and the sewage output of the Rhino. And the industrial areas up here and public areas with schools and parks scattered throughout. Urban planning will always be the balance between conservation, adaptation, and the new shiny on the horizon. Most would agree some historical buildings, neighborhoods or districts are worth preserving, despite being less and less in tune with time. But where to draw the line is fraught with difficulty, and no matter your decision, people will be left disappointed. Many are the cities that miss areas that, in the attempt of riding the wings of progress, were replaced with something that feels mass-produced and lacking any real value. Then again, this is of course also a case of hindsight bias. Much of the lost we wouldn't want to ever see again in our close proximity. This doesn't seem to ever be realized, luckily. For starters, how would you even scale a city like this? It is difficult enough to do in a city with circular planning, without having to adapt to preserving the shape of a specific mammal. Le Corbusier also had grand plans like Haussmann did for Paris. But unlike the drastic changes in the 1800s, Le Corbusier's plans remained on paper. But there are cities that go through with similarly outlandish plans. Of course, Dubai comes to mind. But maybe a more suitable comparison is the capital of Brazil, Brasilia. It is supposed to be shaped like an airplane or an eagle from the sky. Looks quite cool in aerial photos, not gonna lie. But to quote Danish architect Jan Gehl, from the air it looks smashing. From a helicopter it looks really good. And down at eye level, it really looks shit. There is probably no coincidence that many of these grandiose plans were quite elitist, or even fascist. They are often obsessed with creating different neighborhoods for the different classes and create very narrow boxes to put people in. Many of the plans involved tearing down thousands and thousands of buildings, almost always the homes of the poorest. This is a trend we continue to see today in regards to slum areas, a topic for another video. There will never be a perfect solution to urban planning, no right or wrong answers, only better and worse, and we will only know which with time. But when someone comes to you with plans for restructuring on a grand scale, like this or this, maybe we should step back for a second and make sure people are part of the plan. Thank you for watching.